My beloved child, I know you have grown accustomed to opening doors. You open them out of habit, out of kindness, out of fear of being misunderstood. You learn to say, "It's okay," even when, inside, you were already weary, and then you blamed yourself whenever you wanted to close a door, as if closing it meant the end of love. I see it all. I see the smile you try to hold in place. I see the nod you give when your soul wants to step back. But I come to return to you a truth. My love is not weak, and true love knows how to guard. My child, I come to tell you something very important, very gentle, yet very sharp. My love is not soft in the sense of being fragile. My love is not something pushed around by emotions or by the expectations of others. My love knows how to protect. My love knows how to keep watch. My love does not only know how to open doors, it also knows when to close them, not out of fear, not out of selfishness, but because what I am building within you is holy. Imagine a house. A house is not a house because its doors are always open, but because it has a foundation. A foundation must be guarded. I did not build you to be a hallway that everyone passes through. I built you to be a place with a firm foundation, with walls, with doors, with a boundary between what is inside and what is outside. What I have placed within you is holy. You do not need to keep doors open just to preserve the image of being nice. You need to guard what I am planting so that it may grow. I know there were times you were exhausted simply because you wanted to be kind. You thought that if you did not allow something, you would hurt others. You thought that if you set boundaries, you would lose your good image. And so you endured. You tensed yourself. You gave even when you had nothing left to give. You opened doors even when your soul needed rest. I was there. I saw you sitting alone after those moments of kindness, your heart empty, your body tired, and you wondering why love had drained you so completely. My love does not drain you. If something carries the name of love but slowly costs you your peace, your rhythm, your strength, then it has already drifted away from my source. I do not call you to love by tearing yourself apart. I do not call you to open doors while neglecting the foundation. I call you to love in truth, and truth knows how to protect what is holy. You may feel uneasy hearing this. A part of you may react and ask whether this is selfish, whether this is closing your heart. I understand that reaction, but stay with me a little longer. Let me gently touch the way you have defined love. For if you continue to love in ways that wear you down, you will soon have nothing left to offer. What I placed within you was not meant to be depleted, but to grow. There is a very delicate boundary. You must learn to discern the boundary between compassion and obedience. I know you are loving. I know your heart is easily moved. I know you do not want to see anyone abandoned, anyone hurt, and you do not want to be the one who closes doors. But I must say this to you, compassion must not override obedience. When compassion moves beyond my voice, it no longer brings life, it becomes a burden. You cannot use kindness as a substitute for my voice. You cannot take emotions as your compass and call it faith. There are times when you do what looks very good in the eyes of others, but I know you have moved out of rhythm. And being out of rhythm, even with good intentions, will still leave you tired. You have wondered why you do so many right things, yet your heart is not at rest. You have sighed not because you hated what you were doing, but because deep inside you knew you had not asked me first. I place before you a scale. On one side is compassion, on the other is truth. When these two are balanced, you walk in peace. But when you load too much weight onto compassion while neglecting truth, the scale tips, and you begin to carry a weight that does not belong to you. You call it responsibility. You call it loyalty. You call it love. But I call it a burden. Remember the ancient story. When Saul kept what I had commanded him to discard, he thought he was doing something good, offering the best, believing his intentions were right, but he did not obey. And there, he lost his rhythm with me. I do not tell you this to accuse you, but to help you understand that good intentions cannot replace obedience. Doing the right thing at the wrong time, in the wrong rhythm, outside of my word, will always leave heaviness in the soul. You have done good things that did not feel light. You have allowed things while your heart was tense. You have helped, only to want to disappear afterward. I know. I was there. I heard your sighs in the nights when you did not dare name your exhaustion because you feared being called selfish. But I tell you, this obedience to me does not make you hard, it makes you free. When you obey, you do not have to carry what is not yours. When you obey, you do not need to keep people close through endurance. When you obey, you are allowed to release what I did not assign to you. And in that release, your soul exhales. You may be sighing right now. That is all right. Let that breath leave your chest. Let me lift from your shoulders the burden you have carried for too long. I do not need you to be good by human standards. I need you to be obedient in my rhythm, and my rhythm always leads you into life, never into exhaustion. I want to remove from you a garment you have worn for too long, the garment of the Savior. You put it on without being asked. You wore it with the best intentions, but it does not belong to you. I am the Savior. You are not. And when you try to become what only I can be, you will grow weary to the bone. You have often said, "I'll take care of it." You said it reflexively. You said it even when you were already overloaded. You said it because you believed that if you did not carry it, everything would fall apart. But my child, you do not hold this world together. You do not hold other people's souls. You are not called to carry everything. I call you to walk the right path, to keep the right rhythm. My rhythm is not rushed. My rhythm does not press down. My rhythm has room for rest. When you take on burdens I did not give you, you begin to fall out of step, and even a slight misstep will gradually pull you away from peace. Remember the two women long ago, one busy, one still, one doing many right things, one choosing simply to remain. I did not rebuke service. I reordered priorities. For when you place doing above remaining, you will soon be depleted. When you place responsibility above presence, you will carry a burden that is not yours. I do not need you to prove that you are useful. I do not need you to become everyone's support. I need you to stand where I place you. And that place is not always the place of fixing, rescuing, or standing in the middle. Sometimes that place is simply to sit still, to listen, and to say, "This is not mine to carry." When I remove the garment of the Savior from you, you may feel empty. You may feel less important. Stay with that feeling for a moment, for behind it is a lightness you have not known for a long time. Behind it is gratitude, as you realize you do not have to strain to be loved. You do not have to carry burdens to belong. You are loved because you are you, not because of how many problems you can solve. I invite you to lay things down, not everything, but the things I did not give you. When you lay them down, your hands will be empty. And when your hands are empty, only then can you receive what I am placing into them. When you begin to understand that you are not required to save everyone, you will start to see more clearly what has truly been entrusted to you. I am not taking meaning away from you. I am returning your focus. That focus does not rest in how many ties you manage to hold together, but in whether you are guarding what I am building within you. What I am building is not loud. It does not seek attention, yet it is holy. It needs to be protected. And boundaries are not signs of closeness. Boundaries are signs of maturity. When you set a boundary, you are not saying that you do not love. You are saying that you love enough to stop moving out of rhythm. I know you are learning. I know you still feel unsure. There will be moments when you set a boundary and feel guilty. There will be moments when you say no and your heart races. I am not urging you toward perfection. I am simply inviting you to stay close to me as you practice. Each time you pause to ask me, each time you choose not to react out of old habit, each time you choose peace over image, I am there. You will begin to realize that when you keep the door, not everyone leaves. Those I send to you will respect your boundaries. They will not pressure you, rush you, or drain you. They will walk in the rhythm I am leading you in. And those who cannot endure that boundary, I will use that very boundary to reveal that they are not called to remain in this season. I am not making you lonely. I am making you clear. And clarity brings peace. That peace does not come from everyone being satisfied. It comes from you walking the right path. When you walk the right path, I take responsibility for what you leave behind. Remain in gratitude. Thank me that I did not allow you to continue exhausting yourself in the name of love. Thank me that I am teaching you a love with foundation, with doors, with watchfulness. What I am building in you will stand not because you are strong, but because you have learned obedience. And as you step into the next part of the journey, remember this: boundaries do not cause you to lose love. Boundaries keep love alive. I want you to look at boundaries with healed eyes, no longer seeing them as cold walls or defensive reflexes, but as the fence I place around a garden that is being carefully tended. That fence is not built to punish anyone who wishes to enter, but to protect the tender life forming within you. You have grown used to thinking that if you set a boundary, someone will be hurt, and so whenever you need distance, your heart tightens as though you are doing something wrong. But I see something else. I see a garden without a fence, where new shoots are trampled, not out of malice, but because too many feet pass through. I see your time being invaded, your emotions stretched thin, your attention divided until there is no space left for me to speak. You call this love, but love cannot grow in chaos. What I sow in you needs quiet soil, order, and stillness so that roots may grow deep. When you begin to understand that boundaries are not meant to exclude people but to preserve what is holy, the defensive reflex within you softens. You no longer set boundaries out of fear of being hurt again, but out of recognition of the value of what is growing. Safety appears not because the external world becomes gentler, but because your inner world is no longer unconsciously invaded, and that safety opens a new kind of openness, not one driven by fear of loss, but one grounded in discernment of what may enter without damaging what I am building. When boundaries are placed rightly, you begin to hear again something you once overlooked: peace. I do not place peace in you as an afterthought following a decision, but as a signal that comes before a quiet yet faithful guide. You have been accustomed to deciding under pressure and haste, then asking me for peace afterward so you can endure what you have chosen. But my peace does not function that way. Peace is a compass. A compass does not comfort someone already lost. it points before the step is taken. When peace withdraws, it is not a sign of weakness or lack of faith, but an invitation to stop and listen. I am not urging you to move faster than the rhythm I am leading. My voice does not compete for attention. It comes like a very gentle breeze, just enough for those who listen to recognize it. Remember that there was one who heard me not in the strong wind, not in the fire, not in the earthquake, but in a still, small whisper. As you learn to read the signal of peace, the confusion within you begins to dissolve. You no longer need constant confirmation to soothe anxiety, nor must you force yourself forward when something inside has already drawn back. You stand more firmly not because you see the whole path, but because you trust that I am present in that rhythm of peace. I need to speak clearly to you about the cost of a new season. A new season is not purchased through depletion. I do not renew you by draining you dry. If you must bleed in your soul to maintain a relationship, if every act of loving costs you more vitality and more capacity to remain with me, that is not the price I require. You have confused sacrifice with erosion, believing that the more it hurts, the more it is real. That the more exhausted you are, the more you must love. But true sacrifice carries life within it, while wrongful erosion leaves emptiness behind. Even when it is called by beautiful names, you have felt this after every time you tried to hold a tie together through sheer endurance. After every encounter that left you depleted, after every giving that drained your desire to pray. I am not calling you to continue paying that kind of price. What I am building requires you to live, not to be worn down. When you dare to name erosion and stop, an awakening takes place. You realize that not everything that makes you tired is holy, and not everything that causes pain comes from me. As you enter that awakening, you begin to see that boundaries, peace, and the new season are not separate concepts, but one unified flow. Boundaries create space for peace to speak. Peace directs you into the new season, and the new season confirms that the boundaries you set were not selfish, but wise. You no longer need excessive explanations for rhythm-keeping decisions, nor must you justify why you need to slow down. Clarity replaces tension. The new season does not arrive in noise, but in a quiet reordering. What drains you naturally falls away. Connections that cannot withstand boundaries depart on their own, and what remains is what does not require force. I do not lead you into a new season by keeping you trapped in cycles of exhaustion, but by placing you in a garden with fences strong enough for the life inside to continue growing. You do not yet need to see all the fruit. It is enough to know that the soil is settled, the roots are taking hold, and what I have sown is being protected. There is something you need to relearn from the beginning. Not every feeling of discomfort that arises when you set a boundary is a sign that you are wrong. You have grown accustomed to equating other people's tension with your own fault. So each time you create distance, your heart immediately looks for ways to fix, soothe, and retract. But I tell you, this growth is often accompanied by an initial, uncomfortable stillness, because the old systems within you and within others are no longer being fed as they once were. When you are no longer willing to have your time, emotions, and energy encroached upon, what once functioned smoothly through your compliance will begin to react. That reaction is not a measure of your rightness or wrongness. It is simply a sign that the boundary is doing its job. A garden looks different the moment a fence is put up. Old paths are blocked. Familiar shortcuts are interrupted, and accustomed footsteps are forced to stop and look. I do not ask you to explain that fence to everyone. I only ask you to keep it in place long enough for the life within to grow. During this time, peace will not always arrive as a pleasant feeling. Sometimes peace comes in the form of no longer being pulled, of not having to respond immediately, of being able to sleep without carrying someone else's story into your dreams. You need to learn to recognize these subtle signs. Peace is not the absence of all conflict, it is the presence of inner order. As you hold your boundaries, that order is gradually restored. You begin to know what is yours and what is not. You begin to hear more clearly when I tell you to move forward and when I tell you to wait. And in that clarity, you realize that many things that once exhausted you were not difficult in themselves, they were simply never yours to carry in the first place. I want you to pay attention to a very small but very important movement, the moment you are about to say yes out of old habit. And then you pause because peace is not there. That moment is where maturity is being formed. Before, you would override that signal with reasoning, with compassion, with the fear of disappointing others. You called that love, but I call it ignoring the compass. When you learn to pause, not to argue with me, but to listen, you will see that many decisions do not require further analysis. They only require you to honor the withdrawal of peace. I do not demand that you understand every reason why I say wait. I simply invite you to trust that if I am building something new, I will not lead you down a path that drains you before you arrive. Stability begins to emerge when you no longer allow your rhythm of life to be dictated by the urgency of other people's needs. You do not become indifferent, you become ordered. And that order allows you to love without depletion, to be present without dissolving. You will discover that some connections can only exist when you have no boundaries at all. Once boundaries appear, they naturally fall away. This is not a loss to be mourned, but a necessary sifting so that the new season has room to take root. I do not bring you into a new season by keeping you in relationships that require erosion in order to survive. I bring you into a new season through connections that can breathe in rhythm with my peace. There will be moments when you wonder whether you are becoming too strict, too selective, too different from who you used to be. That question arises when you are moving from a reactive life into a guided one. Before, you responded to every call, every need, every emotion placed before you. Now, you are learning to ask, does this belong to the season I am entering? That shift may make you feel more distant, but in truth, you are becoming more present where presence is required. I do not call you to scatter yourself to prove your love. I call you to focus, so that what I plant is not lost. And within that focus, you begin to see more clearly the boundary between right sacrifice and wrong depletion. Right sacrifice may ask you to step beyond your comfort, but it does not drain your soul. Wrong depletion trains you to live in lacking energy, lacking joy, lacking the capacity to remain with me. I do not give you a new season so you can continue living in such scarcity. I give you a new season so you can enter the abundance of order, where everything you give flows from a source that is filled, not from what remains after you have been used up. When you keep your boundaries, you are protecting that source. When you honor peace, you are keeping the flow from becoming blocked. And when you refuse to pay the price of depletion, you are saying amen with your life to what I am building. A very quiet transformation takes place when you persist in holding your boundaries without rushing to pull them back. Because of the initial discomfort, you begin to distinguish between demands and invitations. Before, every need that came to you carried the weight of urgency, making you believe that if you did not respond immediately, something would break. But as you slow down within the guidance of peace, you realize that not every knock needs to be answered. And not every silence is irresponsibility. There are times when I keep you waiting not to test your compassion, but to protect the new rhythm that is forming. That rhythm does not allow you to be dragged by fleeting emotions or by the fear of being misunderstood. It teaches you that maturity is not about doing more, but about doing rightly right things, at the right time, with the right measure. And as you begin to honor that rhythm, you no longer need to strain yourself to keep everything standing. Many things naturally fall into place without your intervention. Within this new rhythm, you also begin to see more clearly the difference between a nourishing connection and a draining one. That difference is not always visible in outward behavior, but in your inner state after each encounter. There are relationships without major conflict, without harsh words, yet after being near them, you feel smaller, more tired, less able to pray, less able to remain at rest. Before, you dismissed these signals because you believed love required endurance. Now, I teach you to read them as part of the compass of peace. If the presence of something consistently pulls you away from your center, from your ability to remain with me, you do not need another reason to stop. Stopping is not cutting off in anger, it is withdrawing in wisdom. And that wisdom is the foundation that allows the new season to be built not on depletion, but on preserved life. I begin to show you a truth you have avoided for a long time. Not everything you have called compassion originates from me. There is a kind of mercy that does not arise from love, but from the fear of being disliked. You allowed things not because you were at peace, but because you feared changed expressions, cooled voices, being labeled uncaring, losing the image of being easy, pleasant, agreeable, and so you chose external calm over internal truth. You said it's fine while your heart trembled. You smiled while something inside you closed. You reassured yourself that this would prevent conflict, avoid tension, preserve harmony. But I call this false peace, because it requires you to sacrifice the honesty of your soul in exchange for a moment of comfort. False peace always arrives quickly, but it leaves behind a very clear residue, a quiet unease, the sense that you have just abandoned yourself, and a weariness you cannot quite name. When I bring this into the light, you may feel exposed. You begin to realize that not every time you allow something is rooted in love. There are moments when you allow it because you cannot bear the thought of someone being disappointed in you. That realization may stir shame, because you are accustomed to seeing yourself as a generous person. But I do not reveal this to diminish you. I reveal it to free you. For when you look directly at your true motives, you are no longer ruled by them. You begin to see that genuine love does not need to be purchased by being liked. True love does not require you to trade away truth in order to preserve an image. And it is precisely there that a sense of lightness begins to emerge, not because everyone suddenly becomes more satisfied, but because you no longer have to perform a role in order to remain. From that lightness, freedom starts to open, the freedom to say no without defensiveness. The freedom to stand firm even when others' regard is no longer what it once was. The freedom to live within the truth into which I am leading you. I continue to lead you deeper, so that you may see a more subtle form of mercy, mercy as a negotiation. You allow in order to keep the peace. You agree to avoid argument. You yield so that you do not have to face tension. You pay with your own silence in exchange for a false calm. But that calm is not my peace, it is numbness. It keeps you from feeling pain for a moment, but it also dulls your sense of being alive. You have been in such situations before. Outwardly there is no storm, yet inwardly you carry a compressed tempest. You do not speak. You do not react. You do not question, but your mind spins relentlessly. I call this a very dangerous paradox, silence, yet storm. And that storm does not dissipate because you avoid it. It simply waits for another moment to erupt, often as exhaustion, irritability, or a distance you cannot explain. You have used permission as a price. You believed that if you paid enough, conflict would not occur. But each time you avoid dialogue, you surrender another part of yourself. You gradually lose the capacity to speak truthfully. You gradually lose sensitivity to peace. You become accustomed to living in a state of compression and call it harmony. I do not call it that. I call it compromise that numbs the soul. When I expose this, you may feel heavy. You see how much you have paid for moments of peace that were not real. You may tense up when you realize that many of your so-called sacrifices were, in fact, avoidance. Yet it is precisely within that tension that a breaking point appears. You realize that you cannot continue buying stability by extinguishing the inner voice. And when that breaking point comes, you awaken awake to see that my peace does not require your silence in the face of truth. My peace walks with light. It does not walk with numbness. At an even deeper level, I show you a root you have carried for a long time, guilt. You have turned mercy into a shelter for that guilt. You feel guilty when you say no. You feel indebted when you do not comply. You carry within you a vague sense of obligation unspoken by others, yet imposed by yourself. And so, you give not from freedom, but from a sense of owing. I speak this clearly to you. You do not owe anyone your soul as payment. No one has the right to collect a debt with your peace. When you do something solely because you feel guilty, you have stepped out of my rhythm. Even if that action appears deeply moral, remember the image of those once bound by the law, carrying burdens I never placed upon them. They lived in obligation, not in grace. Each step they took was heavy, because they believed that if they did not do enough, they would be cast aside. I did not save you so that you would return to living that way. My grace does not operate through debt. When you say no to what I have not entrusted to you, you are not sinning, you are obeying. But guilt blinds you to the rhythm. It whispers that you are selfish, that you are ungrateful, that you must pay more. When I call you out of that false obligation, you may feel constricted, because you have grown used to living beneath it. Your throat tightens as you realize how often guilt has been the one leading you. And then, as I loosen it, a breaking occurs, a breaking not meant to shatter you, but to lighten you. Light. Because you are no longer paying debts I never recorded. When these three layers of confusion are brought into the light, fear of being disliked, bargaining for peace, and guilt disguised as obligation, you begin to see a clearer picture of how mercy has been diluted. You no longer see yourself merely as someone who is too kind, but as someone who learned to love under the wrong conditions. And that realization does not make you worse, it makes you real. You begin to distinguish between mercy that flows from me and mercy that flows from fear. You begin to sense the difference very clearly in your own body. Mercy from me carries life, even when it demands courage. Mercy born of fear leaves behind a residue of tightness. Even when everything appears calm on the surface, as you learn to recognize this difference, you no longer have to guess. Your body, your soul, your very breath bear witness. And within that discernment, you become freer than ever before. Freedom not to grow cold, but to love without mixture. Freedom not to close your heart, but to stop using mercy as a hiding place. I do not take away your tenderness, I refine it. I do not extinguish your sensitivity, I return it to the guidance of truth. You do not need to rush to do anything with these realizations. Simply remain in the light. The light will continue to separate, to heal, and to restore to you a mercy no longer controlled by fear, no longer bought by false peace, and no longer bound by guilt. I am still leading you, layer by layer, so that what you call love may be returned to its rightful source. I want you to look directly at a mechanism that has long been familiar within you. You learn to make others feel comfortable with you as a way to feel safe yourself. And because that mechanism works quickly, you mistook it for virtue. You mistook it for mercy. But, my child, there is a kind of mercy that springs from fear of being disliked. And that mercy always demands payment in truth. It tells you to swallow what you feel, to shrink your needs, to soften your voice until it pleases others, and then you call it harmony. You have become so accustomed to reading expressions, guessing intentions, and anticipating reactions that whenever you consider holding a boundary, the old fear rises immediately. If I say this, what will they think? If I refuse, they will leave. If I do not allow it, I will be called cold. And so you choose a false form of peace. Everything on the outside is temporarily calm, but inside you tremble. You say let it go while your hands grow cold. Your chest tightens, and you persuade yourself that you are strong, that you are magnanimous. But I know that is not strength. It is contraction dressed up in gentle words. False peace always places you in the position of guarding other people's emotions. And as a result, you have no strength left to tend your own garden. You think you are keeping the peace, but in truth you are trading away real peace to purchase a silence that carries no truth. I do not lay this out so that you would condemn yourself. I lay it out so that you may recognize what has been steering you for far too long. The truth is, you have been more afraid of losing your image than you realized. You wanted others to think well of you, not out of pride, but because you were once abandoned, once misunderstood, once made to feel that love could be withdrawn when you were not agreeable, and so you learned to say yes in order not to be cut off. But I am healing that root, and as I heal it, you will begin to see a very clear contrast. False calm makes you smaller, true peace makes you steadier. False calm forces you to perform. True peace allows you to stand in the truth without needing to defend yourself. You will begin to notice that when you say no in my rhythm, there is still a gentleness present, not gentleness born of fear, but gentleness born of safety. You do not need to harden your voice in order to have boundaries. You only need not to flee from the initial discomfort, for that discomfort is not a verdict of guilt. It is a sign that you are stepping out of an old habit. And when you remain a little longer in the truth, freedom will not come through the applause of others, but through the fact that you no longer tremble at being yourself. I also want you to look at the subtle bargaining that has been hiding inside your compassion you give in order to keep the peace. You stay silent to avoid conflict. You concede so you do not have to explain. You trade a quiet night for the burial of a portion of the truth. But that quiet is numbness. It is like placing a thick cloth over a warning bell so the sound will not hurt your head, and then assuming the problem has been solved. In reality, you have only made yourself unable to hear, and because you cannot hear, you continue to walk out of rhythm. I call this the paradox of silence, with a storm outwardly calm, inwardly churning. You avoid dialogue not because you are gentle, but because you fear that truth will fracture everything. Yet truth does not fracture what belongs to me. It only exposes what was already cracked. Then guilt enters, draping you in a vague sense of obligation, I have to give them another chance. Otherwise, I am unkind. I have to comply. Otherwise, I am ungrateful. And you begin to pay debts I never recorded. You feel guilty when you say no. And so you hide that guilt inside compassion, as if continued endurance will quiet your conscience. But that is not grace, that is debt. My grace does not charge your soul as payment. I free you from this false obligation so you may return to the right rhythm where you can love without being bound, help without being controlled, and remain silent when needed, not out of fear of conflict, but because you are standing in true peace. I do not teach you to say no through hardness, nor through bitterness, because boundaries built on anger quickly become walls, while boundaries built on faithfulness become pillars. You once thought that to keep boundaries, you had to make yourself sharp to change your tone, to guard yourself, to put on a severity that felt foreign to you, and that frightened you, because you did not want to lose the gentleness within you. But I tell you this, you do not need to become someone else in order to have boundaries. You only need to become more faithful to my voice within you. When I place a no in your mouth, that word carries no toxin, no retaliation, no intent to wound. It carries clarity, and clarity, when not mixed with fear, has a strange strength. It does not need to raise its voice to stand firm. You can say no in the same voice you once used to say yes. And if that no comes from my rhythm, it will not cause you to betray yourself. At first, you will worry. You will worry that if your no is too gentle, others will not understand. You will worry that if you are not firm enough, your boundaries will not be respected. And so you hesitate between two extremes, either silent endurance or an excessive reaction. I do not call you to either extreme. I call you to practice a no that stands in the middle where gentleness and firmness meet. You will need to practice, because your old habit is reflex, not discernment. You are used to replying to messages immediately, answering calls even when you are exhausted, agreeing to help even when your schedule is already full. Each time you practice stopping, your hands will tremble slightly. Your heart will beat faster, because you are breaking a pattern that once protected you in the wrong way for many years. But stay in that trembling moment. Do not rush to fix it with excessive apologies. Do not soften your no with long explanations. Steadiness does not come from saying more. It comes from not withdrawing the truth you have just spoken. I know there have been times when you said no, and then could not sleep afterward. Not because the no was wrong, but because you were still listening to the old voice whispering that you had just done something selfish. I am teaching you to distinguish between two things that appear very close: bitterness and clarity. Bitterness always wants to prove itself. Clarity does not need to prove anything. Bitterness carries the memory of being wounded. Clarity carries my presence. When you say no out of bitterness, you will feel your heart constrict. When you say no out of faithfulness, you will sense a space open up within you, even if outward circumstances are not yet calm. That space is the sign that you are standing in the right place. You do not need to confront anyone aggressively. You do not need to slam doors shut. You only need to keep your pillar upright. And that pillar is built not from the steel of self-defense, but from the consistency between what you say and the rhythm I am leading you in. There will come a time when you realize that this gentle no does not cost you the right relationships. It only exposes those that were built on your availability. Messages that once arrived in floods will slow. Calls that once interrupted will have to wait. And in this new space, you begin to breathe more deeply. You begin to feel that you are no longer being pulled in multiple directions at once. The initial anxiety gives way to something else, steadiness. Steadiness does not come from everyone being pleased. It comes from no longer betraying the rhythm of life I am forming within you. When you stand in that steadiness, you will see that gentleness is not weak. Gentleness, when joined with faithfulness, carries a weight that causes others either to respect it or to walk away on their own. And you do not need to decide for them. You only need to keep your no clean, without bitterness, without fear, without retreat. I am not only teaching you to say yes or no, I am also teaching you a third language that you have rarely used before, not yet and wait. You have been accustomed to thinking that every invitation requires an immediate answer, that delay equals lack of goodwill, that if you do not respond instantly, you are disappointing someone. And so you have often answered while your heart was not at rest, agreed while your inner rhythm was not ready, and then carried quiet regret afterward. I do not fault you for this. I simply show you that haste is not a sign of faith, but often a sign of pressure. When I give you permission to say not yet, I am giving you back the right to remain in my rhythm instead of being pulled along by circumstances or by the expectations of others. At first, when you practice saying not yet, your heart will race. You fear the empty space. You fear others will misunderstand you, that you are avoiding, delaying, lacking enthusiasm. You also fear yourself, fearing that if you do not decide immediately, you will miss something important. But hear this: what belongs to me will not pass you by simply because you need time to listen. Urgency often dresses itself as opportunity, but true opportunity does not demand that you betray peace in order to seize it. When you say not yet, you are placing a pause between stimulus and response. And it is in that pause that I have room to speak. You begin to hear your inner rhythm again, to listen for whether peace remains, to discern whether what is being offered gives life or merely adds pressure. That rhythm is like a clock being reset after running wrong for a long time. At first it may feel slow, but over time it becomes increasingly precise. I also teach you to say wait, not to postpone indefinitely, but to observe the fruit. You have decided too quickly before, based on pleasant words, on fleeting emotions, on familiarity. Then, as time passed, you realized that what you agreed to did not give birth to life, but only to more confusion. I do not want you to repeat that cycle. When I ask you to wait, I am not keeping you in uncertainty. I am inviting you into clarity. Wait until words and actions meet. Wait until intentions have time to reveal themselves. Wait until peace confirms or withdraws. Remember that there were those who received great promises, yet had to wait a very long time. Not because the promise was weak, but because the person needed to be prepared so as not to distort what they would receive. Waiting, when it comes from me, does not shrink you. It expands you from within. When you learn to live with not yet and wait, something very important happens. You no longer have to repair rushed decisions through endurance. You no longer have to ask me to heal the consequences of choices you could have avoided had you been willing to pause. You begin to feel more at ease, not because everything has been decided, but because you are no longer being forced to decide. That ease is very different from fear-driven procrastination. It has weight. It stands firm. It allows you to answer honestly, I need more time to pray. I need to observe further. I do not yet have peace. These short sentences return you to your rightful place. You are no longer standing at the center of others' expectations. You are standing under my guidance. And then you will realize that not yet and wait do not cause you to lose what belongs to me. They protect you from what does not belong to this season. Invitations that come from me are not afraid of time. Right relationships will respect your rhythm. Things that require haste in order to survive will reveal their nature when you do not chase them. When you keep rhythm by waiting, peace has room to remain. And when peace remains, you know you are on the right path, even if you have not taken another step. I also teach you a form of love you once rarely dared to practice, loving from a distance. Not because you are cold, and not because you have stopped caring, but because you have learned to distinguish between compassion and enabling. You once believed that if you truly loved, you had to draw near. Open the door. Allow intimacy to return as before. But I tell you this, some connections do not need closeness to prove love. In fact, unchecked closeness is often what distorts love. Loving from a distance feels like a paradox to you, because you were used to proving your heart through constant presence. Yet that paradox is precisely where maturity begins. You can intercede without enabling, bless without unlocking doors, keep your heart tender without returning to the old cycle that once wounded you. When you practice this, the first emotion is often not peace, but ache. You ache for what once was, for familiar moments, for the hope that things might return to how they were if you tried just a little harder. It is here that the inner tension appears. One part of you wants to keep distance to protect what I am building. Another part wants to draw close to soothe the longing. I do not deny that ache. I simply place it in the light, so you do not confuse it with guidance. Some aches are not invitations to return. They are signs that you are leaving an old loop. If you do not discern this, you will call returning healing, when in truth, you are reopening the door to what once drained you. Loving from a distance allows you to see more clearly whether your presence is respected or pulled, whether words are matched by fruit or are merely polished memories, whether returning brings order or simply stirs familiar chaos. I know there have been times you reconnected, spoke again, and sensed the difference within yourself. Before, you were easily drawn back into old rhythms, quick to open your heart because of familiar words, quick to hand over the key because of a false sense of safety. Now, standing farther back, you see more clearly. You see that some conversations no longer nourish, they only revive old roles. You see that some expressions of concern lead not to responsibility, but to access. Loving from a distance is not shutting the door completely. It is keeping the door in my hands. You no longer decide by fleeting emotion, but by a peace that has been tested. You do not need to cut off in anger. You simply do not return to the place where you once lost yourself. Distance now does not make you cold. It makes you clear. And in that clarity, you enter a new kind of peace, deeper, steadier. Peace does not come from repairing every relationship, but from no longer granting authority to what has not been made holy. You can remember without returning. You can care without allowing intrusion. You can pray for someone without remaining present in their life in the old way. Loving from a distance does not make you love less. It places your love rightly. When you keep the key to your house under my guidance, you do not lose softness. You preserve it from being exploited. And standing in this peace, you know you are not turning away from love, but walking with me into a more mature way of loving, where what is protected is not only a relationship, but the life I am building within you. I begin to heal you at the deepest place, where you were once guided by something you could not name, emotion, not because you were weak, but because you learned to survive through sensitivity. You feel quickly. You notice change early. You read subtle movements in eyes and voices, and because of that, you melt at an apology, soften at a gentle gesture. You once called this compassion. I call it an unhealed reflex. That reflex caused you to react before discerning, to open doors before asking me, to return to old positions simply because emotions had eased. I do not blame you for this. I touch it in order to replace it. When I touch it, you will feel pain. Pain as you realize how many times emotion carried you away from truth. Pain as you see how often you ignored clear signals because you could not bear the tension between two people. Pain as you recognize that some returns were not led by me, but driven by your inability to endure someone else's sadness. That pain quickly turns into tension. Because you lose a familiar form of control, you no longer have permission to decide immediately by emotion. I hold you there. I do not let you run. I do not let you fix others' emotions so that you can feel at peace. I place you between emotion and truth, where reaction falls away and only choice remains. At that point of tension, a breaking occurs. Not a breaking that shatters you, but a breaking that frees you from being controlled. You realize that emotion is a signal, not a commander. It may alert, but it must not steer. I replace old reflex with clarity. Instead of dissolving at an apology, you learn to ask whether that apology is accompanied by change. Instead of softening at familiar gestures, you learn to see whether they produce order or merely temporary relief. I teach you to discern as those before you learned slow to trust surfaces, unwilling to entrust themselves to pleasant words, attentive instead to fruit over time. That one once refused to place himself in the hands of those who were not sincere, not because he was hard, but because he understood that the human heart must be tested before it is trusted. When the old reflexes no longer drive you, a lightness appears. It is light because you no longer have to guess intentions, no longer have to monitor other people's emotions as if they were your responsibility. It is light because you no longer dissolve yourself to keep the peace. You begin to experience peace not as a passing wave, but as a foundation. I do not take your emotions away. I place them in their proper order. And when emotions no longer dominate, you do not become cold. You become free. Free to love without being manipulated. Free to listen without having to open every door. Free to remain with me even when the emotions of others are unsettled. This is real healing, not making you less sensitive, but releasing you from being governed by emotion, from healed reflexes. I lead you into a deeper layer, identity. There is something you have carried for a long time. Without naming it, you have lived as though you must prove that you are lovable. You endured in order to stay. You tolerated so as not to be left. You tried to understand, to empathize, to carry more, because somewhere within you lived a quiet belief that if you were not good enough, love would withdraw. That belief left you ashamed because you gave much but were not kept. Ashamed because you stayed too long in places that made you smaller. Ashamed because you did not dare say no, even when you were exhausted. I touch that shame and allow it to break. It breaks not to make you bitter, but to reveal the truth. You are loved before you agree. You cannot purchase my love with endurance, and you cannot preserve real love by trading yourself away. I loved you when you were still weak, before you acted rightly, before you knew how to keep boundaries. And because you are loved in this way, you no longer need to hold anyone in place through pain. This truth releases you from an ancient burden, the burden of having to prove yourself. From that breaking, a warmth spreads. Warm because you no longer stand before love in a posture of begging. Warm because you no longer need to endure in order to be worthy. You begin to see that when you say no from a restored identity, that no does not push people away, it places you where you belong. It has been said that perfect love drives out fear. And when the fear of losing love no longer rules you, you no longer have to act against life itself to keep others close. I weave this truth into your heart, not as a slogan, but as a foundation. From that foundation, light appears. The light is not harsh, but it is clear. You begin to see that you are no longer someone who must be held at all costs. You see that genuine relationships do not require you to shrink in order to survive. You also see that places that love you only when you endure are not places where love is truly at work. I am not making you proud, I am making you steady. And that steadiness gives you a very practical freedom, the freedom to say no without guilt, the freedom to withdraw without feeling disloyal, the freedom to stay when needed and to leave when it is time. Because you know you are not bargaining with love, but walking within a love that has already been given. When identity is restored, I place before you another mirror, so that you may distinguish something you often confuse: loving others and fearing loneliness. There are relationships you have held on to not because you were being nourished, but because you could not bear emptiness. You once chose to remain in rooms full of people yet hollow, because you feared the quiet room. You endured not out of love, but out of fear of having no one. And that fear caused you to cling to presence, to voices, to the feeling of having someone long after your inner rhythm had gone off course. I do not reproach you for being afraid. I simply tell you the truth. Crowded does not mean right. There are places that are full, yet I am not there. There are relationships that are loud, yet they pull you out of rhythm. When I invite you to choose emptiness with me rather than crowdedness without direction, you will feel cold. Cold because familiar noises no longer mask the emptiness. Cold because you must face the truth that some things you held were only to avoid being alone. And then fear rises. The fear that if you let go, no one will remain. At that point, I hold you not by filling the room with other people, but with my presence. When you remain with me in that emptiness, you discover that emptiness does not mean abandonment. Emptiness is space for rhythm to be recalibrated. Emptiness is where you hear my voice again, once drowned out by too much noise. When fear is held, you stop clinging. And when you stop clinging, you begin to love differently, loving without needing to possess, loving without endurance, loving without trading away the life within you. From that staying, peace comes. Peace does not arrive because you have more people, but because you no longer need people to fill the void. You begin to discern clearly. Loving others is wanting what is good for them, while fearing loneliness is wanting them to stay so you do not feel empty. When you can distinguish these two, confusion lifts. You can bless without grasping. You can be present without clinging. You can walk alongside when the rhythm is right and step away when it is not, without feeling cruel. I have not brought you here to make you isolated, but to place you rightly first with me, and from there into relationships that do not require you to trade yourself away. I want to realign how you understand miracles. You have grown used to thinking that miracles occur when I change circumstances, when I move mountains, open doors, and reverse what stands before you. But many times, what I am doing is not changing the scene, but changing you. The first miracle I give you is not loud, does not invite applause, but it touches the very place where you were once pulled without resistance. That miracle happens when you stop at the right moment. You are standing before a familiar invitation, a familiar reflex, a familiar emotional current, and instead of being swept along, you stop. That stopping does not come from strained effort, but from a very real moment you exhale. You notice that you are being pulled, and you return to me before you react. Before, you reacted very quickly, not in anger, but in reflex. A message arrived, and you had to reply. An apology appeared, and you softened immediately. A tension surfaced, and you rushed to smooth it over. You lived in a state of constant stimulation and called it responsibility. I call it being pulled. When I begin this miracle in you, it feels like a hand gently but firmly intercepting, not to force you to stand still, but to ask a question you rarely asked yourself: does this come from me? That question creates a brief silence, but it is enough to break the grip of reflex. In that silence, you begin to listen, not with your ears, but with an inward settling. Your heartbeat slows. Rising emotions are named, no longer enthroned. And here, a door opens, not outward, but inward. You realize that you do not lose power when you stop, you regain it. You do not miss what belongs to me when you stop, you only miss the loops that once drained you dry. This miracle is quiet, but it transforms the way you walk, from being pulled to being led, from reflex to discernment, from chasing to remaining. As you learn to stop, I begin to rebuild in you something that has been eroded for a long time: inner authority. You once surrendered this authority without realizing it. You allowed the reactions of others to determine how you felt. You let their satisfaction or disappointment define whether you were at peace. And so your peace became conditional when they were happy. You felt light when they were upset. You felt burdened when they were silent. You felt lost. I saw this, and I said peace was never meant to be negotiated this way. At first, when I began to restore that authority to you, you felt discomfort. You realized that you could no longer control other people's emotions, and that unsettled you. You had grown used to pleasing others in order to keep the peace. So when I disengaged you from that mechanism, a sense of resentment surfaced. You felt it was unfair. You felt that you had tried so hard and yet still found no rest. And it was precisely at this point that light broke through. You recognized that my peace had never been found in your ability to please anyone. My peace is found in the union between you and me. When that union is rightly ordered, others no longer hold the authority to define your inner state. That illumination led you into a new kind of stability. Stable not because you had done everything correctly, but because you knew where you were standing. You no longer had to chase after others to repair their moods. You no longer had to guess whether you were enough. Peace was no longer a reward granted after you fulfilled your role. It became the ground on which you stood in order to act. And from that ground, you could love without dependency, help without being controlled, listen without losing yourself. This was the second miracle. No one any longer had the power to pull your peace out of my hands. When you stopped, when you reclaimed authority, something very natural occurred. You created space. At first, that space made you uneasy. You had grown accustomed to fullness, even when that fullness came from things that depleted you. When you said no to those things, your schedule became lighter, your mind quieter, yet your heart grew anxious. You wondered whether you were missing something, whether this space would turn into loneliness. I did not rush to fill that space. I invited you to remain in it for a while, so you could learn the difference between emptiness and lack. In that waiting, you began to realize that space is not a punishment, it is room. Room for me to lead. Room for the right people to enter. Room for the right rhythm to take shape. Before, your calendar was too full for me to enter. Now, as you are no longer being pulled by what drains you, I have room to pour in. I do not always fill it immediately. At times, I simply sit with you in the quiet, allowing you to become accustomed to not being rushed. And it is within that familiarity that gratitude begins to take root. Then you will see that the space is no longer empty. It is filled with clearer guidance, with relationships that do not require you to bargain yourself away, with a rhythm of life that does not exhaust you. You realize that every time you say no in the right place, you are saying yes to what I am preparing. And when you look back, you will call it a miracle, not because circumstances changed dramatically, but because you changed position from being pulled to being filled, from depletion to restoration, from chasing to walking with me. I do not change seasons with loud noises, nor with signs that require you to explain yourself to the whole world. I change seasons through inner clarity. There was a time when you lived in confusion, not because I was silent, but because too many voices crowded in. You listened to one person, weighed another, watched reactions, guessed expectations, and eventually found yourself in a fog, unsure what truly belonged to me and what was merely pressure disguised as responsibility. I do not leave you in that place. When a new season arrives, the first sign is not a change of scenery, but discernment. You begin to see clearly what opens your heart in peace and what makes you brace yourself. That clarity is not loud, but it is consistent. It does not require justification. It does not demand long explanations. It simply asks you to follow. When this clarity emerges, you will notice that you stop doing something very familiar, explaining yourself. Before, every decision needed to be wrapped in reasons, so no one would be uncomfortable, so no one would misunderstand. You explained because you were afraid of being misjudged, labeled, or having approval withdrawn. But the new season does not operate on that fear. When I confirm something within you, you no longer need to convince anyone that you are walking rightly. My confirmation does not arrive as emotional intensity, but as a straight line. It does not waver under opposing opinions, nor fade when you are tired. And because it does not need noise, you can walk lightly. You walk without looking back to see who is following and who is not. The movement from confusion to clarity is something you feel in your body. Your shoulders grow lighter. Your breathing deepens. You no longer feel the need to hold multiple fronts at once. The lightness does not come because you are doing less, but because you have stopped moving out of rhythm. You realize that many things once occupied large portions of your life without ever belonging to me. And when you allow them to fall away, life does not collapse as you once feared. Instead, a quiet confidence begins to form, not because you control everything, but because you know you are walking in what has been confirmed. A new season does not need proclamation. It reveals itself through the steadiness of the one walking within it. Once the new season is established through clarity, I speak to you about something very practical: calling. Calling cannot endure leakage. You once believed your problem was a lack of ability, opportunity, or resources, but often the issue is not lack, but loss. Your time leaks into tasks you were never called to do. Your energy seeps away through relationships that only take and never strengthen. Your emotions are drained by recurring tensions where you have been afraid to set boundaries. I do not entrust you with a calling and then abandon it within a system that leaks like this. When I teach you to establish boundaries, I am teaching you to preserve what I have given. At first, you feel tired, because you realize you have lived in a state of depletion for far too long and called it faithfulness. Your weariness does not come from the weight of the calling, but from carrying too much that never belonged to it. As you awaken, you begin to see the leaks, clearly conversations that drag on without producing life. Rushed promises. Tasks done just a little more but repeated without end. This awakening is not meant to make you harsh, but precise. You do not need to do less, you need to do what is right. And to do what is right, you must decide not to allow your calling to be drained by what I did not assign. That decision brings you into a more sustainable rhythm. Sustainable not because you endure more, but because the leaks have been sealed. When you say no to leakage, you say yes to endurance. You will find yourself with more energy without doing anything extra. You will notice focus returning, not because you force it, but because you are no longer fragmented. Calling is no longer a burden you must brace yourself to carry. It becomes a directed flow. And you understand that boundaries do not make you selfish, they make you faithful, faithful not to every surrounding need, but to what I have placed in your hands. When boundaries are set in their proper place and strength is kept in the right rhythm, I begin to teach you how to open the door, not to everyone, but rightly. Before, you either open too easily out of fear of isolation, or you shut yourself too tightly out of fear of being taken from. Neither is what I desire. Boundaries were not created to turn you into a fortress. They were created to help you unite with the right people at the right time. And so, when I bring someone into your path, you will feel cautious. Not cautious because of suspicion, but because you are no longer naive. You have learned that not everything that arrives is meant to stay, and not every friendly approach comes to strengthen. This caution, when placed in the light, gives birth to hope. Not hope that something new will fill what is old, but hope rooted in trust that I am leading you. You observe. You allow time to do its work. You do not open the door merely because of pressure to be close, to be quick, to belong. And in that waiting, you begin to feel safety. Safe not because you are defending yourself, but because boundaries are now working on your behalf. You can see clearly who comes with respect and who comes with demand, who walks in rhythm with you and who only wants to draw from your rhythm. When you open the door to the right people, a very different warmth appears. Not the warmth of emotions that flare quickly, but the warmth of healthy communion. You are not drained after each encounter. You do not have to reshape yourself to fit. You are lifted, not taken from. And you come to understand that boundaries do not isolate you. They protect you from misaligned connections so that there is room for the right ones. The new season does not close its doors to people. It closes its doors to pressure. And within that space, I continue to lead you not by fear, but by an ever-deepening trust. I do not take you far merely so that you might live in moments that blaze and then fade. What I do is deeper than that. I reset the climate within you. When boundaries are established rightly and rhythm is kept true, peace no longer comes and goes with circumstances. It remains. Before, you called peace a rare feeling that arrived only when things were temporarily settled. Now you recognize peace as a foundation, a ground on which you stand, from which you choose, and by which you are no longer thrown off balance by outward change. This climate is not loud, but it is steady. It does not require you to strain to protect it. It holds you by my consistency. That new climate reveals itself in the most ordinary details of life. You wake without carrying the burden of having to fix everything. You step into the day with enough inner space to listen. When something unexpected happens, You are not thrown off. You adjust your rhythm. I do not promise that the wind will stop blowing, but I promise that the ground will no longer shift beneath you. And when the ground is firm, you do not need to overreact. You stop at the right time. Choose the right direction. Leave when it is time to leave. Stay when it is time to stay, not out of fear, but out of clarity. There will be days when you are surprised by your own calm, not because you have grown numb, but because you are no longer being pulled. Words that once unsettled you now pass by without power. Pressures that once forced you to prove yourself no longer rule you. You begin to see that the miracle is not in winning every battle, but in no longer having to fight battles that were never yours. This climate of peace does not erase emotion. It places emotion in order. And within that order, you live without being swallowed. I place you back into your own life, but in a new position. Before, you stood at the edge, living while avoiding, participating while defending. Now, you stand at the center, neither dissolving into others nor cutting yourself off. You work. You love. You carry responsibility. Yet you do not lose your center. Your identity is no longer suspended on the reactions of others. You no longer have to ask, "Am I okay?" every time a wave rises. You know where you are. This resetting does not happen through one great decision, but through small choices repeated. You keep boundaries when you are tired. You wait when things are unclear. You say no when necessary, and you say yes when peace remains. Each choice lays another stone. Gradually, you realize that you are no longer living by peaks and valleys. You are living by rhythm. That rhythm is enough for today. It does not demand that you strain for tomorrow. I do not pull you out of life. I make life no longer pull you under. In this new identity, you do not need to leave the world in order to be faithful. You remain and are present without being consumed. You can listen without having to carry. You can help without having to rescue. You can love without having to trade yourself away. This does not come from technique, it comes from position. And that position is in me. When you are in the right place, life becomes the space where I work, not the arena where you must struggle simply to survive. Now I invite you to remain, not to remain in a beautiful moment, but to remain in the rhythm of daily obedience. There will be times when you are tempted to return to old ways for quick solutions, to familiar cycles to avoid waiting, to noise so you do not have to hear stillness. But you know differently now. You know that returning does not make you safer, it only pulls you farther from the center. And so you continue. No hurry, no proving. Simply continue. This continuing takes on very ordinary forms. You keep times of rest. You protect your energy. You do not open doors out of pressure. You do not close doors out of fear. You let time do its work. You allow fruit to reveal itself. You do not guard boundaries with tension. Boundaries are held by my presence. And when you slip out of rhythm, you return more quickly, more lightly, without self-condemnation. Remaining does not mean never wandering. Remaining means knowing the way back. In that continuing, you will discover that what I begin, I complete not through leaps, but through sustained faithfulness. You do not need a different life to be faithful. You need to be in the right place within this life. And when you are in the right place, everything else finds its place as well. Not loudly, not fearfully, not in haste. Simply a life set in the right rhythm where boundaries do not lock you in, but open you to what I am doing. Today and tomorrow, I want you to understand that the climate of peace is not given merely for your comfort. It is given so that you can hear the small instructions that were once swallowed by noise. When you lived to please, you were always like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. One sound made you startle. One remark made you immediately adjust. One glance made you doubt yourself. Now, in this new climate, you no longer react like someone constantly being chased. You have space to slow down, to view a matter from multiple angles, to ask whether it is producing life or taking life away. And that very questioning is a sign of maturity, not because you have become calculating, but because you no longer confuse responsibility with being pulled, love with being consumed, gentleness with the loss of boundaries. This climate also reveals another truth to you. Boundaries do not only protect you from others, they protect you from the waves within yourself. There are days when no one pressures you, yet you still pressure yourself. You push yourself into too much, telling yourself that if you do not do more, you will be useless. You make promises out of fear of being forgotten. You cling to connections out of fear of emptiness. I am healing this as well. I am teaching you to set boundaries with the inner urgings themselves. Sometimes the no you need to say is not to someone outside, but to the panic within you. Sometimes the wait you need to speak is not to an invitation, but to the impulse to fix things immediately just to escape discomfort. And when you speak in this way, you no longer live compressed. You begin to live as one who has a foundation. A foundation does not mean you never tremble. It means you do not collapse. I also want you to notice a very small yet very real sign of an inner miracle. You can be misunderstood without panicking. Before, the moment someone thought wrongly of you, you rushed to explain, rushed to correct, rushed to prove yourself. You feared being labeled. You feared losing affection. You feared having affirmation withdrawn. But the climate of peace allows you to pass through, misunderstanding the way one passes through wind. You feel it, but you are not carried away by it. You no longer place your identity in the hands of other people's reactions. You no longer feel compelled to fix a story you are not responsible to control. You begin to let truth stand on its own. You begin to trust that what belongs to me does not require your strain to be preserved. And when you stop straining, you become light. Light not because life has ceased to be complex, but because you are no longer carrying what was never yours to carry. In that lightness, you will realize that peace does not make you passive. Peace makes you precise. You know when to speak and when to remain silent. You know when to respond and when to let time respond. You know when to help and when to step back so I may do my part. You are no longer driven by the urge to act immediately in order to prove goodwill. You begin to walk by the rhythm of confirmation, a rhythm you have learned to recognize when peace remains. You move forward when peace withdraws. You stop, and the more you live by this rhythm, the more you see that a miracle is not merely a moment. A miracle is a life reordered, where you are no longer pulled as before, where you no longer have to pay with exhaustion to maintain an image, where you can be in life without life consuming you. I am leading you deeper into a lesson you will need every day. Not every empty space needs to be filled. You have filled space because you were afraid. You feared that silence would bring up questions you had avoided. You feared that emptiness would expose your need to be loved. You feared that without something to do, you would feel small. But I created space as part of the miracle. Space is not lack, it is room for the Holy Spirit to work. When you say no to what drains you, you are not merely refusing an activity, you are opening a door for what I am preparing. And what I prepare rarely arrives in noise. It arrives in stillness. It arrives when you are not rushing. Your anxiety when facing empty space is real. You wonder whether you are missing out, falling behind, letting others pass you by. You wonder whether protecting your time makes you selfish. I know these questions, but I want you to look back. Where did those times lead you? When you tried not to miss out by throwing yourself into everything, they led you to fatigue, to fragmentation, to a soul constantly in reaction mode. I do not call you to live that way. I call you to live as one who is led, and one who is led knows that some things only arrive when there is room to receive them. No one can pour into a vessel that is already overflowing. No one can sow into ground that is continually trampled. I do not only teach you to say no to protect you from what is harmful, I teach you to say no to protect you for what is good. As you practice remaining in empty space, you will learn a different kind of waiting. Waiting not because you lack an answer, but because you are holding the rhythm. This rhythm helps you observe fruit. This rhythm helps you discern who comes to build you up and who comes to take from you. This rhythm helps you hear small instructions, which often come as a very gentle nudging, a peaceful thought, a quiet prompting, a clear sense that needs no justification. You will begin to see that the Holy Spirit does not work only through dramatic moments. He works by recalibrating rhythm. He works by restoring proper order. He works by giving you the right not to be rushed. And that right, for you, is a miracle, because you once lived as though you were always in debt. In this season, you will also learn to allow the right people to enter without running out to search for them. When space is preserved, what I prepare has room to appear. The right people do not enter by intrusion, they enter with respect. The right rhythm does not come through pressure, it comes through resonance. You no longer need to use compliance to keep people, nor do you need to shut doors out of fear. You open doors by confirmation. You keep doors by peace. And when you live this way, you will witness something remarkable. Life is no longer a battle to keep everything together. Life becomes a journey of following, where what is wrong falls away on its own because it has no place to attach, and what is right remains because it does not require you to pay with exhaustion. I want you to carry this into the smallest details: how you reply to messages, how you choose meetings, how you decide whom to help, how you use your evenings. Each small choice is an act of preserving the climate. Each time you preserve the climate, you protect space for the Holy Spirit to work. And each time the Holy Spirit has space, you will realize that the miracle is not that I do everything for you. The miracle is that you become a person who is no longer pulled, someone who can stop, breathe, listen, and step in the rhythm I confirm. I also want you to understand that continuing in the rhythm of obedience is not a straight path without weak days. There will be days when you are tired. There will be days when you touch old memories and feel drawn back to old ways because they are familiar. There will be days when you are triggered by a tone of voice, a reminder, a feeling of abandonment. When that happens, what matters is not whether you are triggered, but what you do after being triggered. Before, once triggered, you would run to fix, run to cling, run to prove. Now, you have another way. You stop, you breathe, you return. And returning is not a religious act. Returning is a new reflex of a restored identity. In this new rhythm, you will learn to speak to yourself with truth rather than condemnation. When you slip, you do not need guilt to force yourself to do better. You only need light to reorder things. I do not want you to live in fear of being wrong. Fear makes you tense. Tension makes you reactive. Reactivity returns you to old cycles. I want you to live by trust. Trust softens you. Softness helps you listen. Listening helps you adjust. Adjustment allows you to continue, and that continuation, quiet, small, unremarkable, creates a durable life. You will realize that durability does not mean never sweating. Durability means not returning to the old path every time you are tired. I will also teach you mercy toward yourself in this season. You have been accustomed to showing compassion to others while being harsh with yourself. You forgive others easily, but struggle to forgive yourself. You say it's okay to others, but tell yourself, I am terrible. This has made the inner climate within you harsh. A harsh climate cannot sustain a new season. I do not call you to live under my nurture, only to build an opposing climate within yourself. I want you to learn gentleness toward yourself in truth, without covering over, yet without condemnation. When you are gentle in this way, you do not become weaker, you become steadier, because you no longer need tension to control yourself. And within this steady climate, you will find that guidance becomes something ordinary, like light sufficient for each step. You do not need to look far ahead in order to feel at peace. You only need to walk faithfully in the portion of today that is given to you. Each day has its own rhythm. Each rhythm has its own boundary. And each boundary carries a purpose to protect what I am building, to preserve strength for your calling, and to guard the right form of unity. You will come to see that boundaries do not impoverish you in love, they give love its shape. Only love that has form can preserve your own form. And when you are able to keep your own form, you are no longer manipulated by pity, by the fear of loneliness, or by the need for validation. You walk in truth, and that truth does not harden you, it sets you free. There is something I want you to recognize as you look back over this entire journey. Boundaries do not appear at the same time as strength, but at the same time as truth. The day you began to set boundaries was not the day you became more rigid. It was the day you no longer wished to live in fragmentation. Before that, you may have been kind, generous, and readily available. Yet your soul was divided into many parts, one part striving to please, one part trying to maintain harmony, one part seeking faithfulness to me, and another constantly afraid of losing connection if you spoke honestly. I did not call you to live in that state. I called you to become whole, and in order to become whole, you must be willing to face the truth that not everything you have called love actually comes from me. When you allow me to touch that place, I do not shame you. I simply bring light. That light reveals old reflexes, how quickly you soften at tears, how easily you dissolve at an apology, how readily you retreat when someone shows disappointment. You once believed this was compassion. But I show you the rest of the picture as well. These were also the places where you were being controlled by emotion. No one needed to strike you with a whip. They only needed to trigger the right guilt. And you would bind yourself. I do not condemn you for this. I heal you. I replace those old reflexes with a slower, clearer discernment where you no longer react to the first wave, but respond from a peace that has been confirmed. This healing is accompanied by a deeper restoration identity. You have lived too long as someone who felt the need to prove they were worthy of love. You believed that if you endured more, yielded more, and held on longer, you would be allowed to remain. But I tell you a truth that forms the foundation of every boundary. You are loved before you agree. My love is not purchased by endurance. When this truth takes root within you, something essential shifts. You no longer need to hold on to what drains you in order to protect your image. You can say no without feeling like a bad person. You can walk away without feeling like a traitor. not because you are indifferent, but because you are no longer living under the fear of abandonment. And when that fear withdraws, another distinction becomes unmistakably clear: the difference between caring for others and fearing loneliness. Some connections you have maintained not out of love, but out of fear of emptiness. You endured simply to have someone. You stayed simply to avoid silence. I do not scold you for this. I hold you and say it is better to be empty with me than surrounded and out of rhythm. Within that embrace, you begin to learn that my presence does not fill through noise, I fill through companionship. And as you grow accustomed to this being with, you no longer cling to others in order to feel that you exist. From there, miracles begin to unfold in ways you did not expect. Circumstances do not change, first your responses do. You pause at the right moment. You are no longer pulled by invitations that are out of rhythm. You breathe instead of rushing. You listen instead of guessing. These changes may seem small, but they dismantle an entire old cycle. You no longer give others the authority to define your peace. Peace no longer depends on everyone being satisfied. It rests in unity with me. And when you keep that peace, you reclaim an inner sovereignty that you once surrendered far too easily. The space you create through the words no and wait no longer terrifies you. At first, there is uncertainty, emptiness, and questioning. But then you see that the space does not remain empty for long. It becomes a place I fill with clearer guidance, with the right people arriving at the right time, with opportunities that do not demand your soul as payment. You begin to understand that boundaries do not close the door to a new season. Boundaries are the rightly timed door through which the new season enters. And when that season comes, it does not need noise. It arrives with clarity, with your no longer explaining, no longer justifying, but stepping forward in what I have confirmed. You preserve strength for your calling by sealing the places of leakage. You open doors to the right people at the right time, not under pressure. You love from a distance without returning to old cycles. You bless without handing over authority. You intercede without leaving your house unlocked. None of these things make you smaller. They cause you to stand more upright in a restored identity. And you begin to realize these boundaries are not doors of fear. They are doors of maturity through which you step out of what once manipulated you and into a life that is guided, guarded, and built day by day in truth. There is a subtle shift that occurs when you have walked long enough in this rhythm. Boundaries no longer feel like something you must remember to enforce, but something you naturally live. In the past, every time you said no, you had to brace yourself, soothe yourself, and accept a wave of guilt. Now, you no longer stand before the word no as if before a battle. It becomes an expression of honesty. You do not use it to push against others. You use it to remain in the right place. And precisely because it is no longer spoken from tension, it carries a different weight, the weight of steadiness. Others may not like it, but they sense that you are not speaking from defense, but from clarity. This quietly reshapes the way you are present in relationships, even though you are not trying to change anything. As boundaries become natural, you also begin to notice something else. You no longer need to constantly check whether you are doing the right thing. Before, you would replay decisions in your mind, questioning whether you had been too firm, too distant, or too selfish. You judged yourself by standards that were not mine, and you grew weary because you could never be certain. Now, as you live closer to confirmation, you no longer need such constant checking. You recognize the feeling of peace when it remains, and you also recognize when it withdraws. You no longer confuse the two. This knowing is not loud. but it is unmistakably clear. It does not make you proud, it makes you settled. And within that settledness, you are no longer compelled to explain yourself to every gaze. This settledness also reveals a new and subtler temptation, the temptation to believe that you are finished. I tell you this not to make you anxious, but to keep you awake. When you have stepped out of old cycles, when you are no longer as easily manipulated as before, you may unconsciously lower your guard. You may think you are strong enough to revisit certain old places just to see, or mature enough to reopen doors that I once closed. But true maturity does not seek to retest what has already been discerned. It honors the process that was paid for. It does not need to prove change by returning to what once wounded you. I do not say this to make you afraid of the past. I say it so that you will honor the present to which I have led you. In this new rhythm of living, you will also encounter a very real truth. Not everyone will be pleased by your change. Some will say that you are different now, that you have grown distant, that you are no longer the same as before. Some will miss the version of you who was easier to predict, easier to yield, easier to carry the weight. Those words may touch an old place within you, the part that was once praised for knowing how to endure. But I remind you, not every sense of missing is a sign that you are meant to return. Some people miss you not because you were fully yourself, but because you once served their convenience. This discernment does not make you bitter, it makes you awake. You do not need to argue. You do not need to explain yourself. You only need to continue living truthfully within the rhythm that has been reset. As you continue in this way, you will see your life gradually take on a different shape. There will be fewer relationships, but they will be deeper. Decisions will be less hurried, but more precise. You will no longer spend your energy maintaining false balances. Instead, you will have strength for what I have truly entrusted to you, and you will come to realize that calling is not only what you do, calling is how you live, the way you keep boundaries, the way you choose rhythm, the way you say yes and no. All of it speaks of what you believe about me and about yourself. When you live this way, life is no longer divided between the sacred and the ordinary. Everything becomes a single, continuous flow, in which I walk with you not only in great moments, but in every small choice. It is precisely there that you will understand more deeply the meaning of a new season. A new season is not a place where you are never tested. A new season is where you are no longer driven by fear whenever testing comes. You stand in a truth that has been sown, watered, and kept. Boundaries are no longer something you must remember in order not to fall. They are the way you walk. And as you walk this way, you do not need to look back to measure how far you have come. You only need to remain in today's rhythm, knowing that I am with you, holding what I have begun, and continuing to build within you a life no longer manipulated, no longer pulled off course, but firmly anchored in my truth and my peace. There is a deeper layer of freedom that you can only touch when you stop living in a state of constant readiness to be pulled. Before, you often entered relationships, decisions, and situations with a part of your heart always tensed, as though you had to be ready to adjust the moment someone was unsettled. The atmosphere shifted, or expectations arose. You called this flexibility, love, consideration. But in truth, you were living as someone without a fixed center, always leaning toward the stronger pressure. I did not create you to live that way. When I restore boundaries within you, I do not merely teach you how to speak or how to choose. I reset your inner weight, so that you are no longer pushed by any force that does not come from me. When that weight is restored, you begin to sense a very different kind of stability. Not stability because everything around you is easy, but because inside you no longer sway with every small signal. You listen more, but react less. You perceive more, but are no longer swept away. This does not make you distant, it makes you more deeply present. When you are no longer governed by the need to please, you are more fully there in every conversation, every moment. You no longer have to guess who you should become in order to be accepted. You are simply someone standing in the right place. And that rightness itself creates a sense of safety for those who come to you with sincerity. Within this stability, I also lead you to face an old fear that often lies very deep. The fear that if you do not hold everything, every person, every connection, life will become empty and cold. You once believed that constant attachment was proof of life. But I show you another image, a room no longer overcrowded, where light can finally enter. Before, you were accustomed to a density so suffocating that every voice had space except mine. Now, as you allow what does not belong to this season to fall away, you find that the room is not cold, but bright. You begin to hear my whisper more clearly, not because I speak louder, but because you are no longer drowned out by too many other sounds. This light does more than guide your path, it illuminates memory. There are things from your past that you once carried as evidence that you must hold others at all costs. Moments of being left, forgotten, or replaced taught you that safety lay in always being present, always responding, always available. I do not erase those memories. I heal how they operate within you. When you are restored in identity, memory is no longer a command. It becomes a story that has passed. You can look back without being governed by it. You can remember without returning. And that capacity is one of the clearest signs of restoration. From this point on, you will realize that boundaries do not only protect the present, they liberate the future. When you are no longer held by old loops, you have space to step into what I am preparing, things you could not previously contain. There are callings, responsibilities, and rightful unions that can only appear when you are no longer fragmented. I do not rush to place them upon you. I wait until you are steady enough to receive without losing yourself. And when you step into them, you no longer walk with fear of failure, but with attentiveness. You know that if peace withdraws, you have the right to pause. You know that if the rhythm shifts, you have the right to adjust. You no longer need to pay with exhaustion to prove faithfulness. In daily life, this change shows itself in very small but very real ways. You no longer respond immediately to every request. You give yourself space to listen. You no longer see rest as irresponsibility. You no longer see yourself as a failure when you cannot keep everyone satisfied. What once filled you with guilt now simply signals that you are choosing differently. And when you choose differently long enough, you discover that life does not collapse as you once feared. On the contrary, it becomes clearer, more ordered, and deeper. I want you to know that none of this is a reward for doing things correctly. It is the natural result of standing in the right position. When you are in the right position, you do not need to resist manipulation. Manipulation no longer has a place to attach. When you are in the right position, you do not need to prove your worth. Your worth is anchored in me. And when you are in the right position, boundaries are no longer temporary fences. They become the shape of the new life I continue to build within you, day by day. Rhythm by rhythm, quietly, yet irreversibly. At a certain point in this journey, you will realize that what I am doing is no longer merely correcting what is wrong, but reshaping the way you exist in the world. Before, you entered every space with a quiet question running beneath the surface. What do I need to adjust to fit? What do I need to lessen so I do not cause discomfort? What do I need to add so I will be kept? These questions operated subtly, yet they kept you in a constant state of low tension, like someone standing on tiptoe for too long. I did not create you to live that way. When I restore your identity, I set you down firmly on the ground, so you no longer have to keep adjusting yourself simply to be accepted. And that settling changes your entire experience of life, even if the external circumstances have not yet changed much. In this steadiness, you begin to see something clearly. Not every invitation needs to be answered, and not every opportunity needs to be seized. Before, you were afraid that if you were not quick, you would be left behind. You feared that if you did not stay open, you would lose something. But I am teaching you a different rhythm, one in which you trust that what belongs to me will not pass you by simply because you are not rushing. This rhythm requires you to stay close enough to me to hear, because it does not follow the crowd, pressure, or comparison. When you live by this rhythm, you are no longer pulled into the anxiety of having to keep up. You begin to walk with the quiet assurance that you are in the right time for your portion. This assurance also changes how you face conflict. Before, conflict always carried a threat, the threat of losing a relationship, an image, or a sense of peace. You often chose to avoid, to yield, to remain silent in order to escape that unease. Now, when your identity is no longer anchored in others' agreement, conflict is no longer a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is simply the place where difference becomes visible. And when difference appears, you do not need to win, nor do you need to disappear. You can stand in your truth, speak what needs to be said with a gentle but steady voice, and leave the rest to me. You no longer need silence to preserve a false harmony, nor hardness to protect yourself. Boundaries are no longer reactions, they are position. As you remain in that position long enough, a deeper shift takes place. You stop measuring your worth by immediate outcomes. Before, if a decision did not bring instant relief, you were quick to doubt yourself. If a relationship cooled after you set a boundary, you assumed you had done something wrong. Now, you learn to read life by a different measure, the consistency of peace. Some choices are not easy at first, yet peace remains. Some steps create a temporary emptiness, yet your soul is not torn. I am training you to read these signs so you are not misled by passing emotions. When you learn to read correctly, you are no longer shaken by how others react to your growth. Within this new rhythm, you also learn to face slowness without panic. I know you once feared being slow. Slowness made you feel unimportant, overlooked, not chosen. But I am redefining slowness in your life. Slow does not mean left behind. Slow means being held. Some things, if they come too early, would break you. Some responsibilities, if placed on you while you are still fragmented, would exhaust you. I do not withhold what is good because I am stingy. I withhold it because I am protective. When you understand this, slowness no longer agitates you. It becomes part of trust. You begin to see that what I lead you into always comes with the capacity to carry it, not merely the burden to endure it. I also want you to notice how boundaries have changed your inner language. Before, you spoke to yourself in harsh commands: try harder, endure more. To achieve this, now, you begin to speak in gentler truths: that is enough. Pause. Listen longer. This language does not make you weak, it makes you honest. And that honesty opens the door to a life that is less artificial, less performative, less masked. You no longer live to preserve the image of being a good person at all costs. You live as someone being led by me. And one who is led does not need to manufacture light. When all of these strands weave together, you will see that what I am building in you is not a phase, but a foundation. This foundation does not make you immune to hardship, but it keeps hardship from defining you. You can pass through difficult seasons without losing yourself. You can love without erasing yourself. You can serve without being drained. And you come to understand that boundaries, from beginning to end, are not something I add to your life to limit you. They are how I protect what I have placed within you from being lost, distorted, or manipulated. On this foundation, you continue walking not because you are perfect, but because you have been set in the right place for me to keep working, day by day, in truth and peace. There is another kind of freedom that appears only when you no longer have to defend yourself against every possibility of being misunderstood. Before, you lived like someone wearing a thin layer of armor, not strong enough to protect you, yet heavy enough to exhaust you. You did not realize you were wearing it, because you called it tact, good manners, sensitivity. But that armor required you to guess intentions, read expressions, adjust your tone, and manage your face so as not to create disturbance. I did not create you to live as someone who must constantly interpret and explain themselves. When boundaries are firmly established within you, that armor begins to fall away not because you become careless, but because you no longer need to protect a fragile image. You are placed in truth, and truth does not need defense. This change brings you face to face with a familiar anxiety if you do not hold on. Will you be abandoned? Before, that question governed many of your decisions, even when you did not name it. It kept you staying longer than necessary, giving one more chance, enduring one more cycle, hoping that this time things would be different. I do not deny the desire to stay, to be chosen, to belong, but I separate that desire from fear, because when desire is led by fear, it becomes a restraint. I teach you to live in the truth that you do not need to hold on to anyone by sacrificing yourself. What belongs to me does not need to be clutched. What does not belong to me cannot be kept, no matter how tightly you hold it. When you allow that truth to sink deep, a strange and steady resting emerges. Resting does not mean you no longer desire closeness. It means you no longer panic when distance appears. You can be alone without feeling lacking. You can be in a crowd without dissolving. You begin to experience my presence not as a place you run to when you are exhausted, but as the ground you stand on while you live. And that ground holds you when external rhythms shift. You are no longer thrown back and forth between hope and disappointment. You stand in the middle, where you can observe without being swept away. From within this state of rest, I show you more clearly the old mechanisms that once governed you. You recognize that there were times you said yes not because you agreed, but because you feared other people's discomfort. You recognize that there were times you remained silent, not out of wisdom, but out of fear that conflict would expose your fragility. I do not reveal these things to shame you, I reveal them to free you. When you see the mechanism clearly, it loses its power. When you name the fear, it no longer controls you in the dark. And when fear withdraws, your choices become truer, cleaner, less entangled. This truth also reshapes the way you love. Before, You loved by dissolving yourself, by letting boundaries blur, by proving loyalty through endurance. Now, you love with a presence that has form. You no longer need control in order to stay connected. You no longer need to sacrifice your identity in order to be close. You allow intimacy to grow within safe space, where both sides are free to be themselves without intrusion. This change means that some relationships cannot continue as they once did, and that may grieve you. But this grief does not pull you back into old cycles. It simply confirms that you have crossed a threshold of maturity. When you stand within this threshold, you will see that I am not only leading you away from what exhausts you, I am leading you toward what you can carry without losing yourself. I am not building a closed life within you. I am building an ordered one. This order does not exclude emotion. It places emotion in its rightful place. It does not exclude people. It chooses the right ones. And within this order, you no longer need to remind yourself daily about boundaries. Boundaries become the way you breathe, the way you choose, the way you remain in truth. I want you to know that this continuation has no loud ending. It is like a steady current, where you do not need to leap in order to see that you are moving forward. You advance through faithfulness in small things, stopping when it is time to stop, waiting when it is time to wait, opening when I confirm, closing when peace withdraws. Each small act weaves a life no longer manipulated by fear, by the need for validation, or by unhealed memory. And as you live within that life, you do not need to ask whether you have gone far enough. You only need to remain in this rhythm where I am with you, holding you, and continuing the deeper work I have begun, patiently and faithfully. There is a very particular stage in this journey when you are no longer strongly pulled by what is misaligned, yet you are not fully accustomed to the new freedom. You no longer rush in as before. But within you, the question still arises at times, if I do nothing, will everything slip out of my hands? I am very near to you in this stage, because this is where many souls return to old cycles, not because they want to, but because they have not yet trusted that stillness can also be a form of obedience. Before, you believed. Faithfulness always required movement, action, quick response. Now, I am teaching you that there are moments when faithfulness takes the shape of standing still, not from powerlessness, but because you are holding rhythm for what I am doing beneath the surface. When you stand still in this way, many things within you are exposed, with no action to conceal and no busyness to distract. You begin to hear more clearly the small voices that were once ignored. There is the voice of old habit, urging you back to familiar solutions because they offer a sense of control. There is the voice of fear of being forgotten, whispering that if you are not visible enough, you will disappear. There is the voice of comparison, reminding you that others seem to be moving faster, doing more, being seen more. I do not silence these voices immediately. I allow you to hear them in the light, so that you may discern which voice is mine and which voices once ruled you. And in that discernment, you begin to stop reacting to every sound. You choose to listen to one voice alone that leads the way. This choice brings you face to face with a very subtle grief, the grief of no longer belonging everywhere. Before, you could move into many spaces, hold many roles, maintain many ties. Now, as you live by boundaries, some doors quietly close, not because you are excluded, but because you no longer fit those spaces. This grief is not dramatic, but it is real. I do not rush to fill it. I sit with you in it, so that you do not mistake the sorrow of a changing season for failure. Some things fall away not because you did something wrong, but because you have grown, and maturity always carries a quiet kind of loss. Within that quiet, you begin to see that not every distance is separation. Some distances are formed to protect life. You no longer need closeness to love. You no longer need to know everything to care. You no longer need to be involved in every detail to prove faithfulness. I am teaching you to love with freedom, where love is no longer entangled with control, anxiety, or fear of loss. This love is not cold, it is warm in a lasting way. It does not need intensity to feel real, it stays long enough to bear fruit. As you love in this way, you also begin to recognize something essential. You no longer use mercy as a way to avoid truth. Before, there were times when you called avoidance, compassion, silence, patience, and the inability to ask questions, keeping the peace. Yet deep within, you knew you were bypassing things that needed to be named. I do not fault you for choosing the safest path you knew at the time. But now, I invite you into a new form of courage, one where you do not need harsh confrontation, yet you also do not need to shrink yourself. You can speak truth with a gentle voice. You can set boundaries without slamming doors. You can leave without destroying. And it is this quiet steadiness that reveals what is real and what existed only because of your constant yielding. In this new rhythm of life, you will notice that many issues, which once troubled you, dissolve on their own when you no longer supply them with energy. Some conflicts survive only on reaction. Some ties exist only as long as you keep pulling. When you stop, when you hold boundaries, when you remain in peace, those things lose their fuel. I do not need you to fight them. I need you not to feed them. And when you stop feeding them, you see clearly that power is no longer located outside of you. It has been restored within you. Where I am with you, I want you to understand that what I am building is not meant to remove you from life, but to allow you to live within life with a center that cannot be displaced. You will still face choices, pressures, invitations, losses, and uncertainties, but you will face them as one who knows where they belong. You no longer need to prove that you are right. You only need to be faithful to the rhythm that has been entrusted to you. And within that quiet faithfulness, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. Life no longer governs you. You are walking within life, held, guided, and continually shaped, not by your own strength, but by my steady presence in each very real moment. There is one more thing I want you to look at directly, so it no longer operates in the dark, the habit of self-doubt, whenever you do what is right. Before, each time you set a boundary, a quiet question rose within you. Am I being unreasonable? That question does not come from a conscience illumined by truth. It comes from years of learning to live by reading other people's reactions. You became accustomed to measuring right and wrong by the level of satisfaction around you. I do not deny that you learned this in order to survive, to belong, to avoid being abandoned. But now, as you have stepped into a different rhythm, this habit no longer serves life. I do not rebuke you for its continued appearance. I simply invite you to recognize it, so that it no longer governs you. When you begin to recognize this habit of self-doubt, you will notice that it often appears immediately after decisions made in the right rhythm. It comes not because you did something wrong, but because you did something different. Each time you do not over-explain, do not rush to soothe, do not circle back to manage someone else's emotions. The old part of you feels its authority slipping away. That part has long survived by controlling the atmosphere. And when you no longer do so, it sounds an alarm. I am there to tell you that this unease is not a signal that you need to go back. It is only the echo of an old system shutting down. You do not need to silence it with arguments. You only need to remain in peace long enough for it to settle on its own. Remaining like this requires you to learn a new kind of courage, the courage to do nothing more. In the past, when unease arose, you would do more explaining, more kindness, one more concession, so the discomfort would disappear. Now, I am teaching you not to use action to treat anxiety. I am teaching you to stand still in the truth that has already been confirmed. At first, standing still in this way is very difficult. You feel as though you are leaving something unfinished, but in time, you will realize that some things are only finished when you stop intervening. Some emotions in others are not your assignment to resolve, and some discomforts do not need to be eliminated immediately. They only need to be walked through in the light. When you no longer rush to treat anxiety with action, a new clarity gradually forms. You begin to distinguish between responsibility and reflex. Responsibility comes from what I entrust to you. Reflex comes from the fear you carry. Before, these two were entangled, leaving you with the constant sense that you had to do something. Now, as you separate them, you become much lighter. You can say, "This is not mine," without feeling callous. You can let a question remain unanswered without feeling like you have failed. And in that lightness, you do not become indifferent. You become precise. This precision also changes the way you look back on the past. You no longer condemn yourself for having lived without boundaries. You begin to see clearly that what you learned through pain was not evidence of weakness, but proof of survival. I do not ask you to deny your past in order to enter a new season. I only ask you not to let the past continue to shape how you choose. When you look back in the light, memory is no longer a burden, it becomes the foundation of wisdom. You know what you have walked through, and precisely because of that, you know you do not need to return there. In this rhythm, I also teach you how to receive the silence of others without filling it with assumptions. Before, when someone was quiet, you would automatically fill the gap with anxious stories. What did I do wrong? Are they upset? What do I need to fix? Those stories consumed much of your energy and were often untrue. Now, you learn to let silence be silence. You do not rush to assign meaning. You allow time and fruit to speak. This frees you from living inside other people's minds. You are no longer trapped in scenarios you have written yourself. And when you are no longer living in those scenarios, you are more present in reality, where I am actually at work. This presence helps you recognize something very important. You do not need to be certain of everything in order to keep moving. There are moments when I give you only enough light for the next step, no more. Before, uncertainty made you panic, because you relied on control to feel safe. Now, you rely on presence. You do not need to know the entire route. You only need to know who you are walking with. And when you walk with me, uncertainty is no longer a threat. It becomes space for trust to grow. In this trust, boundaries are no longer a checklist you must remember. They become the instinct of someone who knows where they belong. You no longer have to remind yourself that you are allowed to say no. You simply speak when needed. You no longer have to convince yourself that you are not selfish. You know you are being faithful. And when you live this way long enough, you will realize that what I am building in you is not merely a better season, but a life reordered from the root, one no longer driven by self-doubt, by fear of disappointing others, or by the need for validation. You are led by truth that has been planted, kept, and is continuing to bear fruit in peace, without noise. Now, as you come to the end of this flow, I am not calling you to do anything more, nor am I placing a new task upon you to prove that you have understood. I am simply inviting you to remain. Remain in the rhythm you are in. Remain in the truth that has been illuminated. Remain in peace that does not need noise. You do not need to carry all my words as a burden to remember. Allow just one thing to settle deeply. You no longer have to live as one who is pulled. What I am building in you already has form, foundation, and boundaries, and for that reason, it has the capacity to stand. I know you are accustomed to ending with a strong resolution, a firm promise, a decisive breakthrough. But today, I do not ask for that. There are seasons that close not with applause, but with a silence deep enough for you to realize that you no longer need to run. You have learned to stop without fear of loss. You have learned to wait without panic. You have learned to say no without condemning yourself. These things are not dramatic, but they are signs of a life that has been set back into proper order. From here on, you will still face choices, invitations, pressures, and even old winds blowing across memory. But you no longer stand where you once stood. You no longer have to open doors out of fear, nor close them out of defense. You can ask me. You can wait for confirmation. You can trust peace as an honest compass. And when you step out of rhythm, you know the way back, not a return to the past, but a return to my presence right here. I do not promise that you will never grow tired, but I promise you will no longer have to be depleted. I do not promise that everyone will understand you, but I promise you will understand yourself more clearly in the light. I do not promise that the road ahead will be wide, but I promise that I walk with you on it. What I am doing in you is not to separate you from life, but to allow you to live within life without losing your soul. And that is the most enduring miracle. Thank you for listening to today's message. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so we may continue receiving the living word together, building a steadfast faith and walking in the boundless love of God. Amen.